Residents of a quiet borough in Devon, England, were alarmed back in 1996. Over 15 eyewitnesses came forward to share an encounter that they had in the Churston Woods. The press called it the Churston Bigfoot. This creature was spotted multiple times. Every eyewitness that came forward had the exact same description. The being was about 5 feet tall, with brown hair covering its body. The strange part about the encounters is people were describing the creature's face as having a green tinge. Despite not knowing each other, all of the eyewitnesses were very consistent with their description.
What are you reporting?
Jesus Christ, you better...
Sir?
Come on, see ya!
Hello?
Get somebody out here.
What's going on now, sir?
That son of a bitch is about 6'9", I don't know.
Do you see him now, sir?
Yes, I'm looking right at him.
Uh-oh.
In for night vision.
This is Callie Crank live from Crab Orchard. You are listening to Sasquatch Chronicles.
Welcome to the show, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight. Got a great show planned for you. We're going to be chatting with Paul Sinclair. We're going across the pond tonight, and Paul's going to be sharing some encounters of this dogman that we have over here in the United States. People are seeing it over there in the UK, and I know Paul calls it a werewolf. I'm not caught up on names. I mean, I don't know what to call this thing. But people are definitely seeing it, and I've had a lot of reports here in the United States of people running into this weird cryptid. So Paul will be sharing that with us tonight, and his documentary, Wolflands, is set to come out this year. I posted a little clip, kind of a teaser of the film up on SasquatchChronicles.com if you want to go check it out. If you've had an encounter and you'd like to be on the show, shoot me an email. My email address is wes@SasquatchChronicles.com, and if you get a chance, check out SasquatchChronicles.com. You can become a member and get additional shows. Let's jump into it tonight. I want to welcome Paul to the show. Paul, thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Wes. It's a pleasure. I've always admired Sasquatch Chronicles, so it's great to be finally talking on your show. Thank you.
Yeah, it's great to have you, Paul, and I can't wait to pick your brain about some of this stuff. And I know we're going to be talking about the Wolfland documentary. Paul actually has a YouTube channel. Go check it out. It's called Truth Proof, and I'll post a link underneath this episode. Go subscribe, check out some of his content. Paul, if you would, tell us a little bit about this Wolfland documentary that you have coming up.
It'll be a pleasure, Wes. We should have the film absolutely complete, including the music. The filming's done by the end of February. We've still not placed it with anybody as regards releasing it at the moment, and we have got some contacts at Netflix and other places, so there is a possibility it might end up there, but that's a possibility, not a definite. It's been 3 years in the making, and I've narrated it. Les Drake's done most of the filming, and I'll tell you about some of the accounts in the documentary, Wes. You know, I personally don't think they're not all werewolf or dogman related. I think we've got Bigfoot accounts mixed in here as well, even though the witnesses, they were just normal, everyday people without an interest in the subject who've seen something that's totally off the wall to what they would expect seeing. And we sort of follow the coastline up East Yorkshire. I live in a fishing town of Bridlington, and when you get towards the cliffs of Bempton and Flamborough and on up North Yorkshire, I realise that some of these locations will have to be Googled. You come into the forests of North Yorkshire, and it's 525 square miles of forest, moorland and farmland, and very remote in places. I know the UK is a postage stamp size location compared to many other parts of the world, but 525 square miles is a fair area to lose yourself in if you're looking for things of an unexplained nature. Not only that, Wes, in the documentary, we've documented the things of folklore as well. So it's not just going back decades and decades, but it's going back hundreds of years. There was a guy called Howard Braley, who 121 years ago wrote about the Barguest of East Ayton, which was a huge fur-covered hound that was said to haunt and terrorise people on the forests and moors of East Ayton. Well, it just so happens that East Ayton is very close to the entrance of the Forge Valley and Broxer Forest, where 3 of our witnesses have had this incredible encounter and gone on film to tell us. 7 miles away, there's a place called Stape. And in the Forest of Stape, back in 2002, a gamekeeper, Jeff, was working there. And he had a strange experience in an abandoned farmhouse. He'd been working as a gamekeeper for approximately 2 years when, in his own words, he says you can sort of walk about on the paths and on the logging roads, but you very rarely venture deep into the forest unless you've got a reason. And this particular day, in an area where he'd been working primarily for many years, he'd ventured into a part of the forest off one of the logging roads that he'd not been in before, and he came across a farmhouse that was abandoned. 40 to 50 foot pines tied up to the sides of it and at the back, and a 30 to 40 foot clearing at the front. It turned out it had been abandoned since 1956. And in Jeff's words, he said that I was in a caravan as part of my job. He said, and I decided to use it as a base camp. He said, I'd gone a bit feral. He said, I weren't bothered. He says, I was working 7 days a week, just about. He said, there was a fire in it. He said, it had doors on. He said, the back door was barricaded, but the 2 front doors locked with bolts. And it's in the middle of nowhere, so nobody's going to intrude on him. You know, he'd not found it in 2 years of working there. So, and there's a well as well, so he'd got clean water, or water that he could boil on the fire. He said, and the strangeness began for him after he'd been in the farmhouse for a few months. His cousin came to stay with him for a few days. I don't know the exact length of time he stayed. He said, but we were walking back along a logging road back to the farmhouse late one night between 10 and 11 p.m. And I said, as I'm walking back, he said, this sphere of light about 4 or 5 foot away from my right-hand side just lifted from the ground. He didn't see it on the ground at the time. It just shot up into the air. Well, Jeff, being a former Marine, he thought that they'd caught a tripwire flare, and he dropped his cousin to the floor, and he dropped on the floor himself. And he expected squaddies to come out of the undergrowth, which never happened. And we are very close. We're about 2 to 3 miles away from RAF Fylingdales, which is one of the main defence areas for the United Kingdom and the rest of the world. It's, you know, the first port of call if anything from another country should want to attack us. So that's why he thought there'd be squaddies. So with his experience, he looked for scorch marks. He looked for any kind of burn on the ground because this thing carried on going. It didn't act like a trip flare and light the area up 500 yards circumference around them. Nothing. So he went back to the farmhouse that night. The next day, he went and looked again for any kind of traces of scorch marks. There's nothing. And his cousin went home. But this is where it becomes a little bit strange, Wes, and this is where the subject of the cryptids, the Bigfoot, the dogmen, whatever you want to look into, takes on the sort of paranormal realm for me, because everything happened after this sphere of light sprang up in the forest. And he said, I was with another gamekeeper, a more experienced gamekeeper, an older guy. He said, and it were new to him as well what were happening. Said we kept hearing a baby crying in the forest. Said we couldn't understand it. Bearing in mind, you will know that these guys were seasoned at what they did. So they knew if it was a hedgehog or something being attacked by a rat or something, because they do cry. I don't know if people know that, and or an animal. He said, we'd have known this was different. He said it sounded like an infant. And we'd walk to where we perceived this noise was coming from, and it'd stop. But it'd start again deeper in the forest. He said, and it was almost as though we were being lured in. They didn't feel any danger at that time, but he felt like he were being watched. He felt everywhere he went, he thought he were being watched. Chopping wood up outside the farmhouse, he said there was like voice, like an inaudible chatter in his ear. He said, but it was so strange, as though there was something right on his shoulder, but he couldn't see anything. So that set the scene. And this particular night, we'll not say the next night, we'll not say 3 days after, a short time after, he's laid in the farmhouse. He's barricaded the back door up. He's bolted the 2 doors at the front, and he's lit a fire. He's had his food. He's packed, got in his sleeping bag, and he's got his feet towards the fire, and his head is on one side, and he's looking up at the window. Oh, that's what happened when he woke up. There's no curtains. Bearing in mind, this place is absolutely in the middle of nowhere and abandoned, or was. For some reason, in the early hours of the morning, he woke up. And he found himself looking up at the window, and he's in darkness. There's just the embers of the fire. So, and suddenly this huge figure came to the window, absolutely enormous in size. He said he could see a head that was higher than the lintel of the window, and it was sort of stooped and looking down. He said there were a bit of backlight, and he could see this outline. Huge deltoids, huge arms, doesn't see eyes, doesn't see teeth. He just sees this monstrous shape, and he's thinking to himself, can it see me? He's clearly looking down into the room, and he thinks he's just in the shadow. And it probably could see him. I mean, we'll never know. And he knows he can't do anything. He's zipped up in the sleeping bag anyway. And even if he'd have got out of it, there was nothing he could do. So he watched this thing 5-10 minutes, he said, and it's just slowly moved away and disappeared. So the next day, the intensity of being watched and the feeling of something being around him all the time was really strong. So he decided, this is his words, I was going to get the drop on it. And he says that in the film. In no way I want listeners to think that this guy had some illusion, some sort of delusions of attacking this thing. There was none of that. But when you see the imposing figure of the man that's telling the story, in the forest with me, you will understand. He said, I wanted to see what it was. He said, and in the clearing that's 30 to 40 foot away from the farmhouse, he said, put a tarp down on the ground, put some warm clothing on. I packed my sleeping bag with clothes and lit a fire, and I set everything in the farmhouse. And then I went and got on this tarpaulin and laid down under the sweep of the pine branches. He said, and sometime during the early hours of the morning, this thing came out of the forest. Now, here's another reason I believe that there's something more than flesh and blood to these creatures. He said, I never saw it walk. He said it arrived, almost as though you're moving a torch beam down the farmhouse. Bearing in mind, it's not illuminated. You can just see this huge dark figure. He said its head was bigger than he said its head was higher than the fascia boards of the lower barns. So we're looking in between 7 and 8 foot tall. And it just arrived. It just moved. No leg movement, no body movement. And it stood at the window. He said, and it stood there with its back to me. And it's looking in. He said, but suddenly I became aware. He says, I don't know why, that this thing knew exactly where I was. Either it knew where I was, Wes, or there's another one watching me, watching it, whilst it's imaginary watching me in the farmhouse, if that's not too complicated to get your heads around. And 5 or 10 minutes passed, it turned and just made its way back into the forest and disappeared into the night. He said he stayed there for, 15 to 20 minutes, and then, I suppose, nervously, went back into the farmhouse. He said he went round the back because that door it was the one he barricaded up. He said he was very nervous on entering because he said, I didn't know if it were in there. So that night, he said, I had a really, really uncomfortable night waiting for anything, a twig to snap, any kind of noise, because he said it was pointless, the size of it was pointless thinking the door's shut, it's going to stop it. His words again, well, it could have come through the wall. And the very next day, he left and he'd never came back. Now, he'd kept that story to himself, perhaps told to his wife and a few close friends for the best part of 20 years, and then contacted me a few years ago. And we've been to the forest. We've since slept in the forest and been to the location and got the full account. But all these stories, Wes, 7 miles away, there's another encounter in a forest. All the forests are linked, I need to add, people. So we've got Stape and we've got Cropton Forest, but they're just named differently. But there's another encounter from August 2018. And we're not that long ago, are we? We're 2018 and we're 7 miles away from Stape as the crow flies. And this is in a forest called Broxer Forest, which in some cultures, a Broxer is a shape-shifting demon. So it's interesting that they have their experience in a forest. I wouldn't necessarily say named after a shape-shifting demon. There's no writings that say Broxer Forest is named after a shape-shifting demon. It's me within the research I have discovered what the Broxer was. So there's 3 witnesses. There's Jimmy and Steve who've gone on camera. Witness number 3 doesn't want to, and that's fine. Jimmy's the guy who picks 2 or 3 locations out every year and they go wild camping to somewhere quite remote. And they picked this place, Broxer Forest, and it's in an 800-foot ravine that's very steep. You don't go down on ropes, but you've got to walk down it very carefully. In some places, you would come down on your bottom because it's that steep, and you've a fair old climb getting up. They arrived quite late. It wasn't dark, but once they arrived and got into the bottom of this ravine, and there's a river close by called the River Derwent, which is interesting, Wes, because watercourses, particularly running water, seem to feature in these cryptid accounts that I've looked into, and I'm sure many other people. The Derwent runs all the way through, and at the back of Flixton, where I first began looking into the cryptids, the Flixton werewolf, which is 11 miles from where I'm sat right now. But we'll jump to Broxer Forest. So, witness number 3, who's not gone on film, started acting out of character. And he said, we're being watched. He said, the light's falling now. We've lit a fire. We've gathered wood. We're setting up our camp. He said, and me and Steve are looking and thinking, what's the matter with him? He said, we got to go. We're being watched. Something's watching us. So we couldn't understand it. He doesn't normally talk like this. All 3 men have no interest in the unexplained or the Bigfoot phenomena or dogmen. So he's getting more and more nervous and saying there's something watching us, we need to go. He said, and then he spots it. He went, look. He said, just in the distance, about 30 to 40 foot away, and it's dark now, he said 2 huge human-shaped amber eyes light up in the darkness. He said, and they're amber. He said, and they're huge. Now, Jimmy's saying as big as my fists. He said, and I'm trying to think of an animal to assign the eyes to. He said, because I'm baffled. I can't work out what it is. And we're worried that witness number 3 is going to run off into the darkness. He's really, really frightened. The uncertainty and the nervousness continued for probably 30 to 45 minutes until in the end, Jimmy stood up because he couldn't take any more of it. He was frightened that his friend were going to run away. And they couldn't get out. It just took an hour and a half to descend this ravine in daylight as the fading light. They knew they weren't getting out. Everybody knows what a pine forest's like, with the branches stuck out in all directions and in the night. So he stands up and takes a few steps towards this creature, these eyes, should we say, and makes a few hissing sounds and shooing sounds, and the eyes disappear. And I guess, I don't know what he said, but I guess he thought, well, thank God for that. That's brilliant. It's gone. And then he turned round to look at Steve and witness number 3. He said, and the looks on their faces were looks of horror. The jaws had literally dropped. He said, so I turned back round. He said, and my exact kind of words were, oh my God. He said, because the eyes, from being 3 foot off the ground, were now 7 foot in the air. And there's no full moon, but there's a bit of backlight to the moon, with the moon, and they can see the outline of this monstrous creature. Sounds like a different description to what the gamekeeper saw. He said, because in Steve's words, when I asked Steve what it was, he went, it was, and I'm stuttering like Steve did. I'm sorry, people, but I'm reliving the moment as they've told me. And he said, it were a werewolf. He said, but if you'd have asked me to draw a werewolf, I wouldn't have drawn that. He said, everything about it was exaggerated. He said, its ears looked too long. He turned to the right a few times and its muzzle looked too long. And we've got these self-illuminating eyes. I don't know what animal within the animal kingdom, apart from we've got sea creatures with bioluminescence, that produces something that eyes that glow without light being thrown on them. Now, they estimate that it watched them all night long, and it stood in the stance, they said, like an American footballer, like as though it were going to charge forward. It was so terrifying that they huddled together. They believe it wanted them to split up. They thought it was growling at them, but it wasn't. They realized it was its breathing. So we've got some physical substance to this thing, even though I'm still suggesting that there's a paranormal aspect or some kind of supernatural aspect to what they were looking at. I think there has to be, in some strange way, even if we can't understand how. So there appears to have been some communication with this creature and Witness 3, because he said to Jim, it wants you to go, Jim. It doesn't want you here. Then he looked at Steve and said, and you, Clarky, he said, it doesn't want you here. It wants you to go. Steve said he was that frightened that he daren't even look at it in the end. He just daren't. He said, now wanted it to be over. He said, I don't care how or which way it ended. I wanted it to be over. And daylight slowly creeped into the forest, and it had gone. They didn't see it vanish. They didn't see some kind of flash of light and it disappeared, but it had gone. When they packed the gear up at first light as hastily as they could, Witness number 3 said, it's still here. It's still watching us. And they got to a certain point in the forest and he said, it's gone. We're okay now. So they waited 2 years, Wes, and I did a live stream and I were talking about some military guys' encounter with what they perceived as a 7 foot tall hyena type creature on the cliff tops of Bempton. And he'd been listening to this, one of the witnesses, and reached out, contacted me and told us about what we've termed the Broxer werewolf. Now, the documentary, we've got 8 accounts from witnesses that are all independent to one another. Some of the accounts are very recent. So, we're going back to, I think, February the 8th, 2019 is one of the accounts. And with 27th of January, I've not got the dates in front of me, but I also remember these things. I must be sad, people. 27th of January, 2020, with an account from a lady and her friend Lee, who saw something on the cliff tops at Flamborough. So, independent witnesses, no interest in the cryptid subject, claiming to have seen something that kind of just defies description. It just doesn't fit into what we would consider normal. I wouldn't think, not within the United States and not within the United Kingdom, certainly not. So there's a few of the accounts, Wes.
Yeah, I can't wait to watch the documentary, Paul. I'm fascinated by the Dogman. I've interviewed many eyewitnesses that have seen it. And what's strange is, every eyewitness I've ever spoke to said it was very physical. No one ever says they ran into a ghost. They ran into a half man, half dog. And, over here we call it Dogman. And I think that's more or less because of the Hollywood movies of werewolf, of a man transforming into a wolf. I think that's why people say dogman instead of werewolf, but that's neither here nor there. We're talking about the same thing. But I've had people run into this thing. I had a cop one time. He was down on the border of Texas and Mexico, and he had pulled over these 3 Hispanic guys. And he started talking with them, and they had looked over to the wood line. Well, all 3 of these guys started saying lobo, 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 which is Spanish for wolf. He looks over, and he describes this half man, half wolf, snarling at him, coming right at him. The guys in the truck take off, and, over here in America, you don't run from the cops, because if you run from one, 100 will come for you. But these guys took off. They were so scared. He took out his service pistol and emptied it into this thing, and he said it didn't really do anything to it. Got in his squad car, and he took off. And he eventually drank himself to death over this whole incident, and he refused to go out there and patrol anymore because, in his words, this thing was following him from place to place while he was out there at night. So he refused to go out anymore, lost his job, and unfortunately lost his life. And it's a tragic account, but I mean, I've had cops run into them. I had a wildlife biologist in Michigan, Matt, and I think it was back in 2019. The episode might be 769 if my memory's right, but he ran into one of these things on his property, and he said it was the biggest wolf I'd ever seen. And he, if my memory's right from the encounter, he's relatively close, let's say 30 yards or 30 feet. He shoots this thing with a 30-06 twice, and he saw the impact of where it hit it, and it's like it didn't really affect this thing. And again, he said it was very physical. It was this weird cryptid he'd never seen before, and it eventually ran off. But, you shoot something at that range with the 30-06, you're going to bring down just about anything. And this creature didn't react. I think, with this dogman werewolf creature that people are running into, there's a long history of it, by the way. But beyond that, there's something very off about this. I don't think it's a normal animal people are running into. It appears to be physical, but I don't think it's normal. There's something wrong here.
I'm kind of on the same page with what you're talking about. I've spoke on quite a few podcasts in America, biggish ones, and I've listened to quite a lot, and I've heard, because obviously we don't have the same interest in hunting that you do in America. I suppose we just shoot pheasant and partridge because we've not got the wildlife that you guys have got. But I've listened to people talking about seeing these, we'll call them dogmen or werewolf. I mean, it seems to be a big thing with people that they want to, one seems to cancel out the other. I'm quite happy. Whatever, I tend to call these things werewolf, but I'm not bothered if people call them dogmen. I don't have an issue with it, but some people seem to do, and they're pushing the narrative all the time. But jumping to what you said, Wes, I've heard people saying, and you brought up that gun, we the 30-06, because I'm not familiar with firearms, but I know that's what was said in one of the podcasts. We lined this thing up in our sights and shot it centre mass with a 30-06. And apart from seeing some kind of splat, it carried on standing, watching them. And that's got to tell you, because there's so many accounts that are similar, that's got to tell anybody listening to these accounts, whether it runs against the grain of what you want to believe or not, that these things are more than normal flesh and blood creatures. That's just my opinion. I can't be persuaded to think that we've got something the size of a bear or a huge brown bear that somehow can withstand bullets, but it's a normal type of animal. I've spoke to American Indians, and a guy called Larry Sesspooch, if anybody's heard of him. I mean, you should look him up and listen to him talking about the skinwalkers. And because I've been looking extensively, I've probably done more research than anybody in the world on the Flixton werewolf. And I was curious because it sounds like the description of the skinwalker. And he was talking to me about it, and he said that these things have the ability to live between two worlds. I mean, I don't expect people to subscribe to my words, but you've really got to remain open to the fact that these things may be a lot more than mere flesh and blood.
Yeah, I admire your work, Paul, because, you're willing to look into all the weird stuff. And a lot of people over here in the States, they won't, like the lights, for example. I know you call them intelligent light forms, and we call them balls of light, but I mean, I like intelligent light forms better, but people see them all the time over here out in the woods. People run into these things, and you have to really look into what eyewitnesses are saying. Now, is it related to the cryptids? Who knows? But at least document the fact that people are absolutely seeing these weird lights. And that's what I like about you, Paul, is, you'll look into all this stuff. You don't throw anything out.
Whatever people want to believe, if that, you can just take from whatever I'm saying, people. And if you don't believe it, if you think that I'm sort of going in the wrong direction, that's fine. I can only go on my own research, and the light form phenomena seems to go hand in hand with cryptid sightings, UFO sightings, and I'm not trying to say that these lights are somehow transporting cryptids around these locations. What I'm saying is location is key, and a lot of the places where things of an unexplained nature are seen, many other types of unexplained phenomena are being reported. It just so happens that you've probably got Bigfoot researchers in these forests. But if you'd got people who are interested in other types of paranormal activities, they would probably be unearthing this phenomena. It's just the fact that many researchers don't seem to want to integrate and cross-reference information, which is a massive, massive loss in my opinion. People are missing a trick, because I've got reports where the spheres of light, which I've termed the ILFs, the intelligent light forms. I had a website back in 2002 called ILF UFO, Intelligent Light Forms. But the place where these lights are being seen, other things of an unexplained nature are also occurring. Back on the cliff tops of Bempton, these lights have been seen going back decades and decades. And I've been into lifeboat logs and Coast Guard logs, because we're right on the edge of the North Sea. The forests obviously are inland, but they're all running parallel. And in some instances, you can get lifeboats being called out from lots and lots of different fishing towns. I'm in Bridlington. 6 miles away, there's Filey. Then 20 miles away, or 18, we've got Scarborough. So people will report seeing luminous red and orange spheres of light over the sea. But we need to describe the lights so that the listener does not think I'm talking about flares. These things don't fly from anywhere or spring up from sea level from a boat or drop from a plane. They just appear, and they'll switch on. You'll see one, and then it'll punch into 4 or 5, switch off, and it'll appear 6 miles down the coast, just switch on again. And no noise. They're totally silent, vivid, yet they're not illuminating the area up around them. And in some instances, the lifeboat is called out from 5 or 6 different locations on the coast to look for a plane that's come down, or a boat in distress. And we'll have 4-hour call-outs, 7-hour call-outs, 9-hour call-outs. Sometimes the lifeboatmen themselves see the spheres of light. Nothing's there. Nothing's resolved. These logs, I'm not talking about just one-offs. They're there every single year going back decades. Yeah, and so much so that now, I don't mean every lifeboatman, but lifeboatmen that I've sort of made aware of this, and the guys that have kindly shared these logs with me, realise there's something else to them. And what happens is, after a call-out, we'll say an 8-hour call-out, everybody goes back and nothing's found, yet clearly something was seen. It just gets put down in the log as a false alarm with good intent. Now, that's telling me it's almost a cop-out, because clearly something very real was being seen. But jumping back to the cryptids, myself and a guy called Lee Haywood went up onto the cliff tops of Bempton in November the 14th, 2019. Lee's a very switched on guy, very articulate. He's appeared in Wolfland for us, and he wanted to find an explanation for the lights. And I don't mind anybody looking for an earthly explanation. I think people, as researchers, as anybody interested within any part of this subject, be it Bigfoot, Dogman, UFOs, we should look for an earthly explanation first. And we've ruled that out. Then we can look for something else. And Lee were convinced that we would find something of an understandable nature to the lights. As we're driving along Cliff Lane to the cliffs, it's about a mile-long single-track road, he started saying, come on then, Paul, what do the lights look like? And quite honestly, I looked out to my right, and there was one in the sky. I said, like that. And then they appeared in 2s and 3s. And it really did. We don't call them the intelligent life forms for nothing. So we parked the car up. I went down onto the cliffs with him that night. We set the camera up. Set a Sony NX80 up, 4K camera, hoping to catch a glimpse of these things. Over the course of that night, I think we saw them 4 or 5 times, and Lee was documenting it. Lee could tell you what aircraft were in the sky. He could tell you even the names of the boats out on the horizon. And I say horizon because depending on what altitude you are on them cliffs, you're looking at between 18 on a clear night and 22 miles to the horizon. So as I'm looking out to sea, I turn round, and in the field at the back of us, there's a hill about 100 yards away. And about 80 yards in, there's a huge sphere of orange light just above the ground. Never seen anything like it in my life, people. All the research, all the years I've been up there trying to film these things, it was huge. Lee's words was, the influence the light gave off was about the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. So I'm spinning the camera around, trying to get some kind of film on this thing, switched it on. It takes a few seconds to come to life, and it's just imploding and gone. Now, where does that come with the cryptids? Well, that was November the 14th, 2019. During COVID, myself and a good friend, Bob Brown, it'll relate back to this story in a moment, Wes, so I hope it's not too long-winded for you listeners. We decided that we'd go on a farm that we knew. The guy let us park my vehicle on the farmland because everything were out of bounds with COVID, travelling and what have you. And we walked across the fields and set cameras up and a couple of chairs, took some warm drinks, and we sat on the cliff tops. Basically, I'm hoping to film these lights, which I've done over the years. I've been going up there years and years, and we do have them on film. Whilst we're there, it's not quite dark. A man walks down across the fields where we'd come from. And he'd got a dog with him, a pointer dog, the gun dog. Said a few pleasantries, how we're looking at the seabirds and that kind of thing, because there's a huge seabird colony here, one of the biggest gannet colonies in England, which we weren't looking at the seabirds, and it was wrong time of year anyway, but we just kind of nodded. When you go out to these places, you don't tell people what you're looking for because it's hard enough, innit, trying to bend people's head around what these witnesses have seen and experienced. And you know something? My job as a researcher, if I've got a witness in front of me who I think is telling me a truthful story, I will back them to the hilt. I really do, because that's what it's all about, the witness. So anyway, jumping away from that, he walked into the distance towards Flamborough Head. About 30, 45 minutes later, he's walking back. Well, it's dark, so he obviously knows we're not looking at the seabirds. And he said, well, what are you here for with cameras, lads? What are you doing? And so I told him, I went on to explain that I was trying to film these unusual lights over the sea, the spheres of light. And he explained that he lived about 4 miles away at a place called Reeton. In between where we were, there's another place called Speeton. So it gets a bit mixed up, but I want to say the words with some clarity so the listeners know. So he said he'd lived at Reeton quite a few years and got windows overlooking the sea, never seen the lights. But there was no condescending remarks from the guy. He seemed quite open. And, he was interested enough. Then he said his goodbye, and off he went. He was on his way. And my friend Bob said to him, just as he's leaving, have you seen any unusual animals? So he said, what do you mean? Well, there has been a large black cat seen up on the cliff tops, Labrador-sized. Over a number of years, it appears on social media. People say they've seen it. It appears in the local papers. And so Bob used that as an example. Obviously, we don't say, have you seen a werewolf? Have you seen a Bigfoot? You've got to sort of tiptoe into these things, should we say. And the guy instantly told his dog to sit down. And he said, well, I can't believe I'm going to tell you this. He said, but seeing as I've got two men in front of me who are telling me they're looking for what sound like UFOs, and now you're asking me about unusual animals, I do have a story to tell you. I have got something to say. And he looked at his dog. He said, he's quite switched on. He's very smart, he said. And he gave us an example. He said, if he sees a rabbit, his stance when he's seen a rabbit is different to if he sees a pheasant. Yeah, that might apply to all gun dogs. I don't know, but this is what he's telling us. He said, I parked up this particular night in 2019. He said, I parked near my home at Reeton. I walked down onto the beach and I was walking towards Speeton, which would be about a mile and a half away, a mile and a half from where we were sat as he's telling us the story. He said, and the dog's acting strange, and I'm looking up on the side of the cliff and I'm trying to work out what's the matter with him. He's seen something, but I can't say what he's seen because he's just acting really odd. So I reached into my pocket and pulled my binoculars. He said, there's a full moon. And as I look up, halfway up this side of this cliff, there's a creature, an animal. He didn't say creature, he said an animal. And he said, and I don't know if it's a large goat or a pony. I can't quite work out what it is. So, but as I'm watching it, it suddenly stands up on two legs. And I can see its outline. He said, and now the funny bit, now the really strange bit, he says, have you watched the film Harry Potter? We actually knew what he was going to say as soon as he said that, because we've had this description before. He said, it looked like the werewolf from Harry Potter. He said, and it stood looking at me in the moonlight. Said, not growling, not doing anything. It's a long way off. He said, I can see this silhouetted outline. He said, and it turned and went over the cliff tops and disappeared. He said, and you're the only people that I've ever told. He says, I haven't even told my wife. Now, we have bumped into him once more. We bumped into him early last year. And there were a few people with us, and we asked him, and he relayed the same story. But where it becomes interesting for me, Wes, and the point that I need to say, I nearly almost missed it then, was that he said it was 2019 and it was November. And it was the full moon. So from that, I can get November the 12th, 2019. That is 2 days before myself and Lee Haywood saw the huge sphere of light on the hillside at Bempton between a mile and a half away. Am I saying that the light is somehow, these things are traveling in it? No. But what I'm saying is this paranormal soup that we're all immersed in these locations of high strangeness, lots of things were exhibiting. And we've got light form phenomena, once again, associated in close proximity by time and location with a cryptid sighting. And I think we've just got to wake up and pay some attention to the fact that, you know, these things could be connected to the paranormal as well as the real.
It's a weird coincidence for sure, Paul. I mean, even in modern day accounts of Sasquatch on people's property, 9 times out of 10, they'll tell you about these weird lights they're seeing on their property. And most Bigfoot researchers have seen the lights. They just don't talk about it. And it has a long history. I think it goes back way before this, but even in World War II, I think the Royal Air Force pilots were first to see these, what they called Foo Fighters. And then the American pilots started seeing them. And if you read some of those accounts, it sounds like modern day balls of light or intelligent life forms that people are running into now. And there's a long history with all this stuff, really. I mean, even Christopher Columbus, you had brought up the sailors that were seeing these weird lights and they were being passed off like, oh, it was an honest mistake. They didn't really see anything. Go read Christopher Columbus, his log he wrote. Where he saw this weird ball of light flying around his ship. He said it kind of reminded him of a candlelight. He even brought the whole crew up to come up and look at this weird light flying around the ship. And so even with this Dogman, has a long, long history way before this, but you know, down there in Louisiana, they call it the loup-garou, and it's a French word. I think it comes from a French term, but you know, even in France, they were executing people who they thought were turning into werewolves. And it sounds crazy to us today, But when you kind of read some of what was going on back then, you understand the hysteria. There was something going on there where, they felt the need to start killing people over this. There's a long, long history in all this weird stuff, and it could be correlated for sure. It's a weird coincidence, that the lights show up when these cryptids show up. Not every time, but enough to definitely take notice. And even in your country, Paul, I mean, you guys have the legend of the old stinker, which was a werewolf. I mean, there's so many things that tie back to the past of people seeing this. I don't think it's anything new. I'm excited to see the documentary, the Wolfland, and I can't wait I love the eyewitness accounts, and I'm excited to see it. Do you have another account that you'll share with us from the documentary?
I can tie the old stinker story in with this. About 45 miles away from where I'm sat now in Bridlington, there's the city of Hull. And back in the late 1700s, they drug man-made drainage ditches to stop areas of Hull flooding called the Barmston Drain. It ranges from sort of 4 or 5 foot wide to 20 foot wide in places, and obviously various depths. And they call it the Barmston Drain because it runs out onto the beach at Barmston, which is about 5 miles from where I'm sat now. And there's a story about a werewolf being seen on the Barmston Drain over decades, and they call it the old stinker. But what I find interesting, and it's wrong really, is that a lot of the stories of this perceived werewolf, and I don't doubt that people have reported it, but a lot of the stories are from Flixton, Flixton's only like 10 or 11 miles as the crow flies from me. And there's talk of the Flixton werewolf attacking a stagecoach in the 1800s and things like that. And a lot of those stories now have been sort of added to the old stinker story to add weight to it. And it's wrong, because Flixton, North Yorkshire, is a tiny village next to another village called Falkton. If you put them both together, Wes, you wouldn't even have a big village. And they run on to what's called the Cars, Carrs. It means reeds and elder, wetlands. And back in Paleolithic times, back in between 8 and 11,000 years ago, it was Lake Flixton. And the early settlements of men in the United Kingdom are found there. The people of the shamanic people of Lake Flixton. I mean, the archaeologists who've done digs there, and it will connect to what we're going to talk about with the Flixton werewolf, have concluded that these people were most likely shaman practicing ritualistic magic and sacrifice based on what they found, the artifacts that have been found. So when I wrote the first book, Truth Proof, the first one, it primarily UFOs, unexplained events, but I got a few reports from the area of Flixton concerning a huge bipedal hound. And when you look back, it goes back into the annals of time. Back in 937 AD, that's over 1,000 years ago, the then King Athelstan ordered that a refuge be built at Flixton. I mean, the writings are all there, people. I've not concocted these stories to sort of write a book. It's there if you want to research it. And the writing goes that it was to protect travellers from wolves. Then it adds a little bit more. Wolves and an infestation of savage beasts then abounding there. Now, we know that wolves would have been prevalent in the United Kingdom back in 937 AD. That's probably 1,085 years ago. However, an infestation of savage beasts. We didn't have bears. They'd gone 1,500 to 2,000 years before that. So what were the savage beasts? And I find that fascinating, particularly when I'm getting reports, I wouldn't say every month, but yearly, of people who claim to have seen this bipedal hound at Flixton. Incidentally, it's been seen as close to the military base, RAF Stakston Wold, which is the oldest operational RAF base in the world. If we jump to Stape, where the gamekeeper had his experience, we're talking a military installation there as well, I find that quite quirky. On the cliff tops at Bempton, we've got the former RAF Bempton. But jumping back to Flixton, there's so many connotations to the wolf. 2 miles away from the village of Flixton, there's another village called Hunmanby. And if you go back in time and get the true meaning of the word, it's hund, meaning dog, hound. Hund man, hound man. Hund man be, farmstead of the hound man is what it means. And it can't be no coincidence. And the river, the Derwent, runs very close to the back of Flixton, Seamer, and all these locations. And I got a report from 1948 from an old guy that lived in the village. When I was doing some research, Wes, I was walking around, not door knocking, but speaking to people and asking them if they'd any knowledge of this. This is back in 2015. And this guy sort of looked at me and had no knowledge of it. And I thought he was laughing at me, really, inside. But I don't know, 6 months passed and I found myself there again. And he said, how far you got? And I told him that I'd found out that the things that similar to what I've just been telling you and about the old Carman's Spittle, the refuge. And he went, well, I've seen it. And this is a farmer. I said, you're joking? He said, no. He said, I just didn't know how serious you were. He said, and I saw it. And we've estimated it were 1948. He said, and there's some burial mounds up on the top of Flixton Wold called Sharp How. It's a barrow cemetery. And I realise as time's running away with us, Wes, but, once again, earthworks and ancient burial grounds seem to be where these things are seen. And he said, we'd no knowledge of this. We were just young boys playing. He said, and it was a summer evening. It's 500 foot above sea level. This ice point around, apart from the old RAF base, RAF Stetson Wold. He said, and we're walking towards a tree growing out of the side of one of these burial mounds, and we stop in our tracks. And it's not night time, but it's late evening. It's getting dark. He said, and this thing it's got its back to the tree and it's in a crouched position. And his words are looking at something in its hands. Now, I said, well, he said it was a dog in the shape of a man. He said, but it was a dog. He said that it lifted its head and looked at us. And I said, well, then what? He said, we don't know. We turned and ran. Now, that's not the actions of a predator. What I'm saying is a predator would have pursued them. But it didn't, and he's lived there all his life since then. Never seen a thing. He'd got more stories to tell me about people seeing it. There's one road into Flixton, it's the A1039, and he put me on to other people who'd seen it. There is a book, Wes, Beat a Scrap book. There used to be a pub called, I think it was called The Stirrup. When we're going back a lot of years, we're probably going back to the 1950s and 60s. And they had a book in the pub, the Book of Werewolves, people's accounts. It still exists. I've been chasing this book now for a few years, and I spoke to various locals who know that the book exists. And we're not talking some kind of printed book. We're talking a book of scribbled reports. So all the ingredients are there, Wes. And the documentary starts in Flixton and it runs through Hundmanby and it runs to the mighty cliffs of Speeton, and we go through those sightings. Then we go up to Scolby Mills, and then we go to the entrance of the Forge Valley and a place called Hackness, which is it's a stone's throw away from where the three guys had their experience in the ravine. And Hackness, incidentally, in ancient times was called Hachanos, which means with the whiskers. All the ingredients. I don't think I'm breaking new ground here, Wes, by making Wolflands or writing about these things, because people had done this long, long before me, and I'm treading in other people's footsteps and sort of reviving their stories as well, and reviving what they'd perceived and what they'd seen, because I think ultimately they were talking about the same things, but with a different vocabulary. It's almost like when you talked about the light travelling round the ship and he thought it looked like a candle. We wouldn't say that today, would we, Wes? We'd have another name for what we were looking at, or some other term.
Yeah, you're right, Paul. And that's the thing. When you really start looking at historical accounts, you kind of have to go to how people are describing it, because they'll call it something else. We have a saying over in the United States. I'm sure you guys have the same saying, the boy who cried wolf. Well, it was actually a real story. I mean, that came from, I believe they got it from the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is 2100 BC. But the story of the boy who cried wolf is actually from about 600 BC. And it's like, well, Why do we still say that today? I mean, there was something going on there where they had this story to kind of tell what was going on. And it's a little bit more than a boy running into a wolf. And, even the Egyptians, they call it Anubis, and it's the guardian of the underworld. And when you start looking at a lot of these dogman encounters, not all of them, but historically, they seem to be around like graveyards and stuff. It's bizarre.
There's so many connotations to the dead as well. Like you've just said, guardian to the underworld and the burial mounds and the ancient earthworks and other places around the world. I'm not subscribing to the idea of lycanthropy, transformation. That's never really come into anything that I've been researching. But when you look at other cultures around the world, West Africa, Sierra Leone, you had the leopard men of Sierra Leone who said they did some terrible, heinous things to sort of make a pact, I should imagine, with what they perceived as the devil, to transform into the leopard. Now, I'm not saying this happened, but there's similar similarities to the transformation of the wolf. And back then, these stories couldn't really cross-reference each other. So in other parts of the world, hundreds of years ago, these things were happening and had been documented. And I find it fascinating. Where did this knowledge come from?
Yeah, I think, with eyewitness testimony, I kind of understand why there was kind of a transformation. People would talk about a man becoming a werewolf, because what do most eyewitnesses say they saw? A half man, half wolf. And it's all over the world. And I really can't wait to check out the documentary Wolfland when you release it, Paul. I want to ask you, I know that you don't know and I don't know, but what do you think that this werewolf, dogman, this weird cryptid, what do you think it is?
I think it's always been here, Wes. I think people will have gathered from this 60 minutes that we've been talking that I do believe it's physical when it's here. The guys in Broxer, they said they could hear it breathing. So that kind of had some kind of physical element to the creature. But there's all these other attributes that take it away. I mean, briefly, and I don't know what time we've got, Wes, but there's another forest very close between Broxer and between Stape called Harwood Dale. And there's 3 mountain bikers going down a logging road. It's not pitch black, but it's late evening. And suddenly they see at the side of them this thing. It sounds like a Bigfoot. They don't say it's got a snout. They said it looks like an upright gorilla, but huge. But the interesting thing, he said, we made a lot of the tracks up there and the trails on our mountain bikes. He said, and we're about 30 foot away in the bracken. He said, and we know that there's divots and logs and huge boulders and little water-filled trenches. He said, but it looked like it was travelling on a sliding track. And we're going hell for leather down this logging road, jumping fire breaks. He said, and this thing's just keeping up with us. And his head's turned looking at them. And they don't see no shoulder movement. They don't see no leg movement. It just smacks to me that these things are something else. There's something outside of the realm that we would call normal. I'm sorry I don't have a better answer, Wes.
No, I appreciate your answer, Paul. I mean, that really would be my answer too. This thing seems to be very physical. Like I said, when people run into it, it's very, very physical. They're terrified for their life. It's not a ghost they're running into, and then you'll hear it do weird physical things, eat, kill things, poop, leaves tracks. But there's a weird side to it that makes me think there's, much like you, Paul, I don't know. I really don't know what this thing is. And I really can't wait for your documentary, Wolfland. And if people get a chance, go check out Paul's YouTube channel, Truth Proof, and I'll leave a link in there. Paul, I've really enjoyed chatting with you, man. I would love to have you back. I know there's different topics you've investigated, and I would love to have you come back to the show.
I would love to come back, Wes. People might think I've been paid to say this, but Sasquatch Chronicles is one of the podcasts, one of the streams that I listen to all the time. And I recommend people listen to it. I really like the way that you conduct yourself, and I like the way that you interview the guests, and I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Well, no one thinks you're being paid for anything. I don't have commercials in my show, so I don't have that sort of money to throw around. I'm just playing. I appreciate it, Paul, and thank you for the kind words, and I'll definitely have you back to the show. And that's it for tonight, everyone. Remember, if you've had an encounter, shoot me an email. My email address is wes@sasquatchchronicles.com, and if you get a chance, check out sasquatchchronicles.com. You can become a member and get additional shows. Until next time, everyone,